So I've got the paper. I just want to make 2 or 3 remarks before that actually begins. The first is that a handout's going around, which is very kindly been copied by Rosie. The other remarks are just really to say something about Lacoue-Labarthe, who you may or may not be familiar with. He was a friend and colleague of Derrida, but more importantly than that, he collaborated regularly with Jean-Luc Nancy. They lived together in a kind of experimental community. They wrote together and lectured together. So this is really a sort of common enterprise often when we're talking about Lacoue-Labarthe. Now this community was based in Strasbourg, in the east of France, and as you know, it's an exemplary European city. You know, it's very much a shared heritage between France and Germany. So I've given previous papers on the two thinkers and their relationship to Europe, and hopefully in what I'm going to say today, some of the questions that were coming up this morning about whether European literature is hyper-national or whether it is comparative and therefore a reaction against the national might be coming through in what I'm going to say. So I'll now start the paper itself. Despite its apparently firm bases in historical reality, the distinction between ancients and moderns has proven adept at provoking controversy and debate. With the 3 figures mentioned in my title, for instance, the shortest of historical surveys would show that Sophocles was an ancient and Hölderlin and Lacoue-Labarthe both moderns. However, things alter once we begin to apply greater pressure to these categories, and it will suggest that the distinction between ancient and modern can be found as an internal division within the work of each of these writers. Before then, however, it's worth recalling the justification for placing together these 3 figures and their 3 different contexts: the 5th century Greek Enlightenment, speculative and romantic thought, and deconstruction in the 1970s and 80s. The first connection is made by Hölderlin, who begins to translate Antigone and Oedipus Rex during his stay in Bordeaux. This location is not indifferent, given that it caused him to write that, and I quote, "The athleticism of people in the south, in the ruins of the ancient spirit, made me better acquainted with the true essence of the Greeks." In other words, he found Greece in Bordeaux, and from that moment began translating into German the 2 Sophocles plays, which were published in 1804, a year before he was pronounced clinically insane. The second connection is then made by Lacoue-Labarthe, who translated into French Hölderlin's German versions of Sophocles' plays, Antigone in 1979 and Oedipus Rex in 1998. Additionally, he worked on stage productions of the 2 texts, thus following in the wake of previous stagings of Sophocles and Hölderlin by Brecht, Antigone in 1948, and Heine Müller with Oedipus Rex in 1969. So Lacoue-Labarthe's approach is thus multifarious, drawing on translation, dramaturgy and stage production, as well as critical or philosophical commentary. Before coming to the latter for the main part of this paper, it would be a shame not to give at least the smallest glimpse of the other disciplines through which he responds to Sophocles and Hölderlin, and with them to the question of ancients and moderns. First, translation. The French thinker's declared approach is a literalist rather than a naturalizing one. In this way, he seeks to reproduce the experience of translation as what has been called an épreuve de l'étranger, relating to Hölderlin's German in the same way as Hölderlin related to Sophocles' Greek. To take a single example, the German Begeisterung could be translated either as enthusiasme, based on the Greek theos, or as inspiration, based on the Latin spiritus. But Lacoue-Labarthe rejects both these equivalents and opts instead to translate Begeisterung as position par l'esprit, a solution that is awkward, even borderline unacceptable, insofar as it adds a new strangeness which is not present in the German, but it does serve his own philosophical aims. As for his dramaturgical and staging work, we can note that it took place in radically different settings. The 2 productions of Antigone were held in abandoned warehouses in Strasbourg, whilst Oedipus Rex was shown in the Corps d'Honneur at the Avignon Festival. Again, few concessions are made to naturalization or naturalism, and minimalist staging aimed to allow an emphasis on the interaction between the actors' bodies and their words. The approach was uncompromising and, in the eyes of some contemporary reviewers, unsuccessful. In any case, it's justified as follows by Lacoue-Labarthe. Theatre is a brutal, pitiless art. It allows of no approach. It is an immediate reckoning with truth, which is to say, with probity. To translate Hölderlin and Sophocles at the same time, to offer him to enunciation, to imagine the space and the gestures, to provide the props, to think about what one must cause to be thought, not to give in to beauty, nor, above all, to emotion, to be just. All of these require a courage about which not even teaching gives us an adequate idea. So something of Lacoue-Labarthe's motivation for working in a theatre can be seen here. We are at once outside philosophical discourse, any approach from an exterior position is ruled out, and, by the same token, brought closer to what he calls thought. And this thought is to be found in the various confrontations and dialectics that tragic theatre provides us with. So let us now come on to how these confrontations feature in Lacoue-Labarthe's critical discussions. Both the object and the status of these discussions provide us with pause for thought. For to state that they address the various dialectics present in tragic theatre and address them in a philosophical way seems close to the truth, but due to this very closeness is in fact a statement that Lacoue-Labarthe would surely reject. Indeed, to a large extent, Hölderlin is chosen as an object of study because he thinks along similar lines to his student friends Schelling and Hegel, but ultimately does so in a less speculative or dialectical way. This can be seen when the French thinker plays on the terms marque, remarque, and démarque, the latter meaning a marking down, as in a commercial sale. He asks, and I quote, "How is the démarque of the speculative in Hölderlin at the same time its marking or its remarking? How, in other words, is the speculative deconstituted? I mean, how is it unmade and deconstructed in the very movement whereby it is set up, installed, established as a system?" The German poet is therefore of interest because he's both inside and outside this speculative or dialectical system. He's the figure whereby its limits and limitations might be determined. In this context of a reading that resembles a dialectic without actually being one, Lacoue-Labarthe often uses the term antagonism. This he often brings into communication with the notion of agony, surely, however, falling into the trap of pathos or emotion that we saw him describing. But at other times, his interest lies in the more neutral root agon, meaning contest, competition, or struggle. And this is particularly suitable as a framework for his reading, given his view that, and I quote, "Tragedy is the site where what makes the essence of knowledge is revealed, as well as what animates the desire for knowledge, being faced with contradiction, and this in the most general terms." There are, of course, numerous ways of understanding contradiction within tragic theatre. These begin with the interaction between physical body and speech, as in much theatre, but also take in the thematized clashes between men and gods, and the formal division between characters on stage and the chorus in the orchestra, the circular dancing space. Hölderlin's friend Schelling wrote on the contradiction between destiny and liberty, arguing that although men are not free from prophecies and the gods in tragedy, the cruel and unusual punishments they receive can act as a spur for such freedom to be demanded. And for his part, Hegel paid great attention to the interaction between Creon and Antigone in Sophocles' play. But although each of these avenues could provide a way of exploring the nexus between Sophocles, Hölderlin, and Lacoue-Labarthe, I wish to explore the presence in unexpected and revealing places of the antagonism between ancient and modern. One of the unexpected places where this division falls, at least on the reading provided by Hölderlin and after him Lacoue-Labarthe, is within Sophocles' oeuvre. On this view, he is not the ancient object read, imitated, or relayed by modern subjects, but instead already performs this leap into subjectivity. Here we are in the vicinity of the old idea that modernity begins in Greece. The detail for this thesis is to be found in the reading whereby Hölderlin relates to Oedipus Rex and Antigone, not in the narrative order in which they feature in this series of Theban plays, where Antigone is the later play, recounting the death of its central figure, who after all is Oedipus's daughter. Instead, Hölderlin reverses this narrative order. Thus, Lacoue-Labarthe can describe the two plays as follows, and I quote, "The two Sophocles tragedies that Hölderlin took as ideally representative of the opposition, which constitutes history itself, between the ancient and the modern, or in his lexicon, between the Oriental and the Hesperian, Antigone and Oedipus Rex." The justification given for this reversal is that the lead protagonist in Antigone defines herself by ancient or archaic values. She defends Polynices' name, doing so because he is her brother, and thus an irreplaceable being in her life, given to her, as it were, before any rationalization or decision of her own. And she defends his right to a decent burial, namely his right to return to the soil, an ultimate homeland more fundamental than the political order of the day. Beyond these factors, she compares her contested martyr state to that of a mythological figure, Niobe, and Hölderlin also adds to his version of the play an invocation to what she calls my Zeus, with underlining the my. In short, Antigone draws out and represents a coalition of relatively obscure, archaic, and ancient forces. The same divisions or antagonisms are present in Oedipus Rex, but because the emphasis is placed contrariwise, Hölderlin takes the play to be essentially modern, or at least evolving in the direction of modernity. Certainly, the action within the play shows a prophecy being given and then confirmed, via what Freud interpreted as the driving force of obscure or ancient forces, the desire to kill one's father and marry one's mother. But within this formal constraint, a number of signs point in a different direction. For instance, Lacoue-Labarthe draws on an interpretation of Oedipus's name different to the usual reference to his swollen feet. He relates the name to Oida, Greek for I have seen or I know, establishing the character as an active, questioning being. Secondly, the myth preceding the play tells of Oedipus killing the Sphinx, an obscure divine force, and doing so by solving the riddle with the answer mankind. He therefore ascends to the throne of Thebes thanks to this ingenuity, recognizing human sameness amongst alterity, a speculative scenario if ever there was one. Third, whilst foretold by the prophecy, it's nonetheless by his acts that the crimes are committed. Fourthly, his downfall is provoked by his rationalizing or totalizing desire to find his father's murderer. Lacoue-Labarthe glosses this downfall in the following terms, which set Oedipus up as an essentially modern figure. So I quote, "At the nadir of his final fury, Oedipus experiences only one thing, the withdrawal of the divine. The god now only manifests itself by suddenly ceasing to manifest itself, by which is meant by leaving mankind in a state of abandonment." This situation is of such importance for Lacoue-Labarthe that he is driven to fuse new connections beginning with it. For instance, he takes Oedipus to represent the French revolutionaries who were Hölderlin's contemporaries and influenced him on many counts. Lacoue-Labarthe writes, "If Hölderlin made this choice of Antigone and Oedipus Rex, it seems to me that it is essentially due to modern political preoccupations. Oedipus, particularly, was a character who was resurfacing in history in the form of the dictator of reason. He was the French Revolution, Robespierre, Saint-Just, and then also Bonaparte. Far-fetched though this may seem, we can recall that Oedipus was king of Thebes, and what's more, one who replaced the Ancien Régime thanks to the use he makes of reason, a crucial element in revolutionary discourse. Beyond this, Lacoue-Labarthe's description of him as a dictator of reason draws on the king's desire to find and punish Laius's murderer, itself surely a commendable aim, just as Crayon's aims in Antigone can be painted as egalitarian and inspired by the rule of law. In any case, the appearance of Robespierre and Napoleon in Lacoue-Labarthe's discussion of the two Sophocles plays translated by Hölderlin serves to confirm that a very lively antagonism between the ancient and the modern is a major issue. On this view, then, Sophocles cannot be taken entirely to be on the side of the ancients. And by the same token, we can ask what can be said about Hölderlin and Lacoue-Labarthe and their relationship to modernity. So we've already suggested that Hölderlin's marginal position in relation to the speculative or dialectical thought of Schelling and Hegel establishes him as a figure not entirely aligned with the dominant modern interpretations of tragedy. And the same could be said for Lacoue-Labarthe. Insofar as being a deconstructive thinker, his attention is given to ways in which overviews arrived at dialectically remain incomplete and always under suspension. Modernity's presence as a theme within the two Sophocles plays makes it easier for Hölderlin and Lacoue-Labarthe to distance themselves from it. Oedipus in particular is seen as a figure of the modern, insofar as his desire for knowledge causes both his rise and fall. On their reading, this is exemplified by the reading I've already mentioned of his name as a modulation of oida, I've seen or I know. And the motif of sight also provides the issue on which the two thinkers detach themselves from Oedipus. This is seen when Lacoue-Labarthe states the following. In accordance with the speculative interpretation of the name of Oedipus, but at a given distance from the philosophical heroization of him that speculative thought always performed, Hölderlin insists, in Greek style, on sight. It is the blind prophet Tiresias who comes to tell Oedipus the following blinding truth, that the very excess of your knowledge, your outrageous pursuit of the will to truth, demonstrates your besmirching and your downfall. Nothing other than the entire destiny of Western knowledge is at stake here. And this is full well what Hölderlin, the thought of caesura, brings into opposition, without opposition, obscurely, if you will, to Schelling and to Hegel. So this statement draws on Hölderlin's remarks on Oedipus, where he adopts a metrical metaphor representing Tiresias' intervention in the play as a caesura, or a counter-rhythmical interruption, in his words. As a blind prophet, Tiresias represents a resistance to the sight-based economy of modern knowledge and understanding, which is thematized within the play. He also features in Antigone, and again in his remarks on that play, Hölderlin prevents this intervention as an interruption in the metaphorical meter of the play. In this light, it's surely significant that Jean-Henri's famous, bleak, and modernized version of Antigone excludes the figure of Tiresias altogether. So such is the way that Hölderlin detaches himself from the modernity thematized within the two plays, and especially in Oedipus Rex. For his part, Lacoue-Labarthe follows the German thinker extremely closely, down to the logic of what he calls opposition without opposition. We can read this formulation as a desire to question and contest dialectical approaches, but without doing so from any exterior, literally opposing standpoint, a standpoint which is posed or posited outside. In other words, he rejoins here the deconstructive principle of contesting a language or discourse without replacing it with any alternative. To simply replace the approaches to tragedy found in dialectical philosophy would merely fall back within their own logic. It's thus better to scan for moments of interruption or caesura, when a breach in the dominant language opens up. Such is perhaps how we can articulate the interrelation of Lacoue-Labarthe's translation and dramaturgical activities to the philosophy for which he is better known. They are not an alternative or a replacement, but instead breaches in the texture of critical philosophical discourse and its propensity for endless talk. Thank you.